So thank you very much for being here. It's a very big pleasure to have you among us for the, I don't know how many podcasts we're at, like how many episodes. So here, if you don't mind, could you present yourself and kind of explain your path from a student to PI and some challenges along the way?
Yes. So first of all, it's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for the invitation. The path from me from being a student to the PhD to right now, I have a kind of, in a way, what it looks like a linear progression, but actually in life, nothing is linear. Since I was a child, I wanted to be a medical doctor. I wanted to study the brain, and I wanted to study brain that goes wrong. I didn't know the name at that time. Now we would call neurodegeneration. And I don't know, I had it in my mind always. So, I kind of target to go to medical school. Of course, it's very different. You have a dream, I will go to medical school and then go through all the trenches to get to medical school, right? You have to study really hard and you have to take, to make sacrifices, like as your friends are going party, you're studying to get better grades. So this is pretty much what I did. And, I think I was lucky, but with a lot of effort, I got accepted in a great medical school. And then I got there and I found most of everything very, very exciting. So, I could easily have gone to another direction. But I think, I was grounded in this idea of brain. So
Mhm.
one of the things I did in medical school, which is something I think all the students need to do, is to explore different opportunities, right? Sometimes we have something in your mind and we think that this is the thing, but we didn't have the exposure really to make an educated decision. So in terms of brain in medical school, I went to see what do psychiatrists do? What do neurologists do? What do neurosurgeons do? And, I ended going up to see what pathologists do. I have no idea what was pathology before medical school. It's not something we have exposure. Maybe we associate pathologists with forensic medicine, these crime scenes, but it's not really that.
Yeah.
And it turned out that out of these experiences, I felt that pathology will be the one really more aligned with what I had in mind. Again, I kind of knew what I had in mind. I didn't know the name or the path for this.
Mhm.
So I decided to go to pathology and then I started my residency. And again, I liked a lot of stuff. I came from a place that we do have research, but it's not as a research is not a career like it is in the US or in Canada. So I felt that if I would be able to do it, it will be on the side. So I
Mhm.
did also some clinical training. But then I had an opportunity to start a PhD during my residency. And this PhD could be in the theme of brain aging, which was not something we had at the University of São Paulo, which despite being the strongest university in all Latin America, this area was incipient.
Mhm.
But there was some support and I had the motivation, so together support plus motivation, I could start doing my PhD. And what I did is also, I think that a good suggestion that students should take in consideration. We need to know what is available for us where we are and how we can leverage this. So if I was trying to do a research study in which I would try to compete or reproduce certain things that can be done in places in high income countries. They have longitudinal studies and follow-ups and imaging and biomarkers. I will go nowhere.
Mhm.
Maximum I will do is just to copy parts of this and say, oh, in Brazil it also happens, which is not a great way to do science. But what I saw is that at the university I was at, they had a very unique autopsy service that was performing about 15,000 autopsies per year. It doesn't exist around the world anymore. And this autopsy service, very well structured, didn't have any research on brain aging or anything like this. So I brought up the idea of having a study done leveraging the autopsy service. Of course, I have to write a project and get IRB approval and get support from a lot of stakeholders. but at least the infrastructure was there. And this I predicted, and my mentors predicted, it was a kind of infrastructure that if we could leverage in the right way, it will put us in a situation that we could produce science that will be innovative, that will really contribute to our knowledge in a way that is just not copy and paste from what someone else did. So, so this is what I did in my PhD. I had this project that I wanted to understand what was the early stages of neurodegenerative disease. What separate normal aging, or what we call normal aging at the time, of something that we start calling pathological, but still very, very early stages.
So you mentioned several times like you have to leverage what you have, and by that do you mean like kind of understanding what's available and also what you can do? But at the same time, would you say that if, for instance, your university wasn't like the best one in Latin America, do you think that would be maybe a little bit harder to do?
It will be harder, but this is also part of my trajectory, right? I kind of target my goals to be able to go to residence to this place. It was not by accident that I ended up there. I mean, we need to understand the landscape we are, right? We cannot be deterministic saying, oh, I am in this place that doesn't have anything to do about what I want to study, so we'll just, accept it. No, I mean, what is the way? Is there a way for you to move to a place that will give you more opportunities?
Yeah, that's a good point.
We need to study the environment, right? And know where we are applying to.
No, that's 100%. And also you mentioned I know we do that a lot. You say like, oh, I was lucky, but like you just mentioned, I think it's a lot of effort, a lot more than luck, you know?
It's both, right? Because you can do all this effort and end up in a toxic environment that no one will help you to grow. And this was not what happened to me. Inside this large place, I found people who were listening and who said, okay, if you want to do it, maybe I don't know exactly how to do it, because as I said, it was incipient, but I will give you support. And I had a lot of support. Again, maybe it was not exactly how do we do that, but even support to send me to places where I can learn pieces of it and then come back and implement this. Most important is that no one create a roadblock. Maybe I had to bring funding, I had to bring stakeholders, but there was no one really trying to stop it.
Yeah, impeding you to do stuff. And also, I guess that people believing in you just by itself is also a push, to keep going.
Absolutely. Because one thing I learned from a very dear mentor when I was just starting and I couldn't understand what he was saying, he said, at this point, some people will give you support. Most of the people won't say anything, so it's good they are not on your way. But if you start being successful, people that didn't pay any attention at the beginning will try to claim ownership to this. And you are in a position of vulnerability because you are relatively young in the chain here. And, there is a limit of what you can do to fight those things. So he said, this is what you have to pay a lot of attention. And of course, have your allies, your mentors and sponsors, right? This idea of sponsor, someone that's really there to fight for you and to put your name. This was very important.
Is that something that you encountered? People trying to take credit for what you did?
Absolutely.
I see.
Absolutely. From, people coming to meetings and saying, I'm so glad you're doing that because, I have started doing this 20 years ago. And I'm glad you like the idea. Now it's helping, in this enterprise or something like that. What? Right? Or people who said, oh, you promised me to send me 100 brains, and call my boss and said, Lea promised me 100 brains. Where are these brains? And I said, I didn't promise anything, So another thing that also I learned early, and it was useful for me, everything I was documenting by email. So if I had a conversation with anyone, I would send an email saying, thank you for the conversation. This is what we talk about. Did you have a different understanding? Because when people came and start saying, you promised me 100 brains, I have this email saying, oh, it was nice to meet you, and you asked me if I can give you 100 brains, and I said, we don't have this capability, and maybe we should talk again. So, it
Yeah.
was important to also establish myself in front of my mentors as someone they could trust, right? I would not go rogue and, start over promising or starting to promote myself in a way that was detrimental to the department or, the people that were supporting me.
I think just keeping a trace of everything is just good practice at this point. Like if you want to not forget things and things like that. We are talking a lot about the Brain Biobank of Brazil. Did you want to discuss your role in starting this brand, but also putting it on the map so people would be interested in working with it?
Sure. Pleasure too. So I was mentioning that I wanted on my PhD to leverage this autopsy service. We had the University of São Paulo. So we had all the IRB approvals, and it was supposed to be my PhD thesis. There was a clinical part that was important also. So my mentor, Wilson Jacó, who was a great guy with great vision, brought someone who was at my career level on the gerontology side, Renata Ferretti, who was interested on the clinical side. So we started to work together. And the idea really was just to make this thesis. Very early when we started doing that, I met by accident a researcher, Rika Verwiet, from the Netherlands Brain Bank. It was really accidental. Who had started a brain bank, a systematic brain bank in the Netherlands in the 80s, which is a very well-established brain bank. And when I told her what my PhD was about, the idea of brain bank was not even in my mind. She said, oh, you are doing a brain bank. And I said, no, I'm not doing a brain bank. I'm doing a collection for my studies. And she said, look, the work that you will put to create a collection for your studies and the work that you put to make a systematic brain bank, what does it mean? That follow standard operational protocols, right? In terms of how you annotate and how you process things, is the same. But, long term, the brain bank will bring more rewards, right? Research rewards for you, for other people. And she was generous to teach us how to do it. It was not just the procedures, but what are the ethical aspects involved with brain donation and sharing brain tissue, right? I think maybe you saw there was a big scandal in Harvard this week because the mortuary person there was selling body parts.
So no, I was not aware. Oh my God.
So imagine for a family, who donate a brain or body part for research and find out that this was sold to someone who was reselling this for a lot of money, right? It was not the initial purpose. It really destroyed the reputation of a program. So from the get-go in our brain bank in Brazil, we had the opportunity to really cover all these possible problems that can arise, especially ethical problems, and do it in the right way. So anyway, so we started to call it brain bank, whatever, right? And following these protocols. We didn't know what we will find. But as I mentioned, we were trying to leverage something that didn't exist elsewhere, which is a community-based autopsy service. Right? People, when they go to autopsy nowadays, either is because there is a suspicion of a crime, forensic pathology, or they enroll in a study, let's say about dementia, and when they die, they donate their brain. But usually people enroll in a program on dementia when they already have symptoms. By the time they die, they are at end stages of the disease. Yeah. So there is not too much you can learn, examine tissue of people at late stages of the disease. As opposed if you have a community sample, you have people dying of different things at different ages. So we are able to capture people who are at different stages of progression of a neurodegenerative condition. And this is exactly what happened in Brazil. And this was kind of unique. Didn't exist elsewhere. And then just by observing this, not rocket science, we started to notice some changes or features that were not in the literature. And this is how this brain bank started to gain visibility, first by the opportunity to bring this kind of participants, research participants, to study, and second by describing, at the beginning it was just description, what were certain early changes that were not in the radar before because people didn't have the opportunity to look for it.
Okay, that's a good point. And I also think that most of the studies in the past did not really take diverse populations. And I really think that having such a bank is something very important, especially nowadays where inclusivity and being able to generalize your results is a very important topic in science at the moment.
Absolutely. Historically, participants of research studies, they tend to be of European ancestry, highly educated. You know, these are people who would understand the importance of enrolling into research, that will have the time to go to research. You cannot just not go to work, so you go to research, right? And also, most of the providers or the researchers, they look like this, right? So there is always this matter of trust when you are enrolling in research. Yes. As minorities, you know, they always feel they don't understand what they are going there, and the providers don't look like them. You know, I mean, it's they don't have this link.
Yeah.
Now, in Brazil, because it was a community-based cohort, you know, we have the same demographics as we have in the population. For the city of São Paulo, it's about 60% Caucasians. And among the 60%, there is a lot of admixture, especially with African ancestry. And then we have about 30% of people that will self-report as Black. But again, a lot of admixture. Some of them have only 20% Black, African ancestry and 80% Caucasians. Then we have a lot of Asians and a little bit of native Brazilian. So it's very diverse, but most important than being diverse is very admixed, because this is most of the world, right? We mingle and, you know, mix ancestry and races, and sometimes it has synergistic or protective effects into disease risk.
It really speaks to me as an Iranian Guatemalan. Very really speaks to me a lot, and it brings me to my next question. What do you think was like the biggest contribution of this brain biobank, given that it's rich in different ethnicities, but also I assume that having such a bank in Brazil allowed more Brazilians to engage with science as well and produce more graduate students or just students in general?
Absolutely. So starting with research contributions, and then we talk about critical mass education.
Yeah.
So about the research. So one of our first observations that we had the opportunity, of course, to conduct rigorous studies on it, is that Alzheimer's disease pathology, especially the tau component, Alzheimer's disease has these amyloid plaques and the neurofibrillary tangles that are made of tau, deposit first in the deep parts of the brain, in what we call subcortical nuclei. And before these observations, the belief is that it would start in the more exterior parts of the brain, in the cortex. So we could show that actually it was the subcortical nuclei. And then people ask, okay, let's say that you are right? And people cannot really prove with other cohorts because there is no other cohort, although it's pathology where they can visualize. And let's say you are right. So what are the consequences to this? Do we have to worry about it, or it's such an early stage that we just call normal aging and, you know, go home and not bother? And we had the opportunity to do a series of studies that only happened because of this cohort in Brazil, showing that this early involvement of the deep brain is worrisome. It, for instance, gives rise to sleep problems, which is something that we see happening before memory problems in Alzheimer's disease in many cases. It also underlies some mood disorders that we start seeing more often in aging population, people that get less motivated to do things or more anxious as they age. And part of it, it's probably related to this early accumulation of tau changes in this deep brain. And to a point that we are now looking at the molecular identity of this and how to repurpose some drugs that we already have on the market, especially for treating psychiatry diseases because they deal with neurotransmission. What is the right formula to compensate early changes that we see in Alzheimer's disease as we are waiting for disease-modifying drugs?
So it had a big impact for sure, like to focus on a completely new section of the brain.
Completely new at the beginning, slow in picking up, but now there are several groups around the world that focus on this, and this is in the radar of everybody. And people that had some opportunity, even if a small scale, to look into this, they found the same changes. It came to the radar, and it has been very transformative. So this was one of the early observations. Another observation that we had, we kind of suspected, but you really have to have pathology to prove, is that vascular contributions to dementia, it's much more important in a population like the one in Brazil, that it's a middle income country, cardiovascular risk factors are not so well treated as in other places. It's more frequent there than in high income countries. So what does it mean? It means that, with this kind of data, we can persuade authorities in putting even more efforts to these campaigns to deal with cardiovascular risk factors, because it does affect cognition later on and costs, right? When we talk to the government, we talk about cost benefits of things. So you have to prove your point.
Yeah.
So it has been instrumental there.
But I think such studies have such a big impact because I work with participants and a lot of people will ask you, what's the purpose?
Yeah.
So it's very interesting to see what you're talking about, that this research on the impact of vascular diseases or vascular risk factors on aging and how this can inform public policies and things like that. So there is a link, unlike what people think sometimes.
Absolutely. We agree with this. I mean, we try to have results that are clinical oriented. Right? Not that basic science is not important, super important, but the way we structure our research is very clinical oriented. And the third thing, we have been examining this influence of ancestry. Okay. And because we have this diverse population, and ancestry is always something, we have to be very careful when we try to explain this kind of research, because race is a very charged topic.
Yes.
Right? And we had bad experiences with trying to use race in scientific thinking throughout the history. More recently, with eugenics, that there were some countries that will even kill a certain part of the population that didn't fit what they call the ideal race. Right? So you have to be careful about it. So, and also race has a lot of correlations, what we call the social determinants of health, in which a fact or risk that is attributed or enriched in a certain race is actually not biological, but it's because this population, they are more exposed to environmental risk factors because of the conditions they are. So like African Americans in the US, they have a tendency to be more poor than other populations. So they won't eat so well. And, there are a lot of stuff. So the way we try to approach this in Brazil, which I think it's another strength that we have there that we might not have in other places, is twofold. So first, there are tools in which we can determine ancestry using DNA. The same thing that 23andMe does, right? When they says, you are, I don't know how many % from Iran and then from Guatemala, whatever. So we do the same. And then we put this on the models. And then we interrogate, is there any association, a risk association with some of these ancestry, and we call ancestry because, again, it's based on DNA that it's worth looking at. And one thing that we found, for instance, is that in people with African ancestry, the ApoE genotype 4, which is the strongest risk factor for sporadic AD, is not a risk factor.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, this was a paper that we published last year. So then came this question, oh, is this a real signal, or this is the social determinants of health, right? That happen to be, in African Americans. So what we did for this, now there are other tools that we can know exactly for each gene in the genome, what is the ancestry of that gene? And this is why it's nice to have a mixed population. So at mixed population, you have people, there is 100%, let's say, African ancestry, 100% Caucasian ancestry, and everything in between. So for these people who are in between, and they have a gene coming from the mother and another from the father, you might have all sorts of combinations. You might have the two genes being from African ancestry, or the two genes being of Caucasian ancestry, or, a mix of this. So this is not so social determinants of health, right? This is very much into the biology and all these combinations. And by looking into this, then we could show that this effect on ApoE was really biological. Of course, there is social determinants of health that will impact in a lot of stuff, but for this particular effect, it was very biological because we could look at the local ancestry and contrast it with the global ancestry, and then contrast this with the pathology and with other social metrics that we had on the patient. So another thing that's make São Paulo population nice to study this kind of question is that, as opposed to other countries, even in the US, that certain ancestry or race, they have, their preferred kind of food or things they will do, and they will call themselves, I don't know, African American, Iranian Americans, Chinese Americans. In Brazil, there is no such a distinction. People call themselves Brazilian. They eat the same food, they eat the same water, they do the same activities. There is much less barriers between these different groups, also because of that mixture that we see in other places. So it's a good population to study the influence of environment versus genes.
I feel like it would be nice to compare, for example, Brazil with like the US, given that the US tends to like the expression of like more of like a salad bowl, or like the US is more like everybody kind of stays in their own different group and has their own different customs. It would be very interesting to compare both. And then again, I feel like those studies are very interesting because, like you mentioned, more and more people are mixed. We see people mixing more with other cultures and, let's say, producing babies that don't just have like 100% one ethnicity or 100% another, which is very interesting.
No, absolutely. And yeah, I believe so. There are some studies in the past comparing this, kind of population with the same genetics living in different places. There was one comparing Nigerians living in Indianapolis with Nigerians living in Nigeria. And there are some studies comparing Japanese men living in the Hawaii with Japanese men living in Japan. And they do show some difference because especially nutrition plays a role.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's crazy to me how nutrition is such an important thing that can affect so many different things, but it's not talked about so much in the public.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with nutrition, I think everybody can agree there is a big impact, but how to really make studies in humans that we can determine the effect of a certain thing, in the kind of diets that we have that are very diverse and so on. This is complicated. And then you have this pseudoscience, people claiming that a certain food is a superfood and selling this, for a good amount of money. And people, that's the problem. I think this is why people don't talk too much about. I think
and it's funny because you and I both work with Alzheimer's, and I have seen books claiming diets that can prevent Alzheimer's disease and things as far-fetched as that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's quite intense. And you know, when you work, and it's very annoying because it creates a lot of misinformation, and then people don't really know who to believe, which
Yeah.
is becomes
And
an
when
issue.
people are desperate, they are
Of
really
course.
going for this. So that's the point. But you asked me about educating the next generation of scientists,
Yeah.
also about the brain bank. And thank you for bringing it up. It's very true. I mean, as I said, when we started this idea, I wanted to do a PhD. Renata wanted to do a PhD, but there was no infrastructure or even a critical mass for this there.
Mhm.
So, moving 20 years forward, both of us, we became full professors, right? So we stay in academia, and there are other 3 people who join us at around that stage that also became professors. And we train more than 120 people in the lab.
That is
So
amazing.
yeah, some of them stay in academia. I would say that a lot of them stay in brain science, some people going to industry, even
Mhm.
some people going to support companies that do brain processing. And, some became teachers on this area. I mean, on biology, lectures in colleges. But one thing I find interesting, we had a lot of students that came from universities that are considered to be second or third tier. Usually they are in a lower strata, social strata uh, of the population. And by having the opportunity to work with us, and of course working very hard because nothing comes free, they
Yes.
could really catapult themselves to another, social stratum
So
because
it
of
was
this
really a good opportunity for them to like not only learn but also to
to advance in life.
yeah.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that bring me the most pleasure, right? To
I can
see
only
people,
imagine.
yeah, because especially in countries like low and middle income countries, the meritocracy is not very established.
Mhm.
So you might have someone who is really smart and works very hard and has a very high work ethics and cannot progress in life because there are several social barriers for this. And this kind of opportunities really open doors. So they should exist more, but it
Yeah.
gives pleasure because they really deserve.
Let's take a little break to absorb all the information we are learning today, and I invite you to go on the QBIN blog where you can find the images of our more recent Art of Imaging exposition. And I hope that from these imaging, you will get why bioimaging is so awesome. Let's get back to the podcast.
It brings us to the big topic nowadays in research about inclusion and colonialism within research. Did you want to comment on that and also maybe comment on the role of the biobank in terms of inclusion and maybe lessening or hopefully getting rid of the traces of colonialism within research?
Right. So, about inclusion, inclusion is an issue throughout the world. It's also an issue in Brazil and other countries in South America. Of course, everybody
Yeah.
is Latino there, so that's not the issue of inclusion. But women still face more barriers to advance.
Mhm.
And, people of color for sure have more barriers to advance. In Brazil, in particular, since a few years ago, many years already, there is an effort from the federal government to improve it, especially with people of color. So there is quotas to go to the best universities. Very controversial, but
Yeah.
anyway, there is a easier way to get there, and also for employment. For women, sometimes it goes better, sometimes it goes worse, depending on the government in all the areas. But
Yeah.
the fact of it is having this brain bank that the leadership is pretty much women, at this point. It's certainly a role model. I know from several of our students who now can aspire to get there. They say, oh, someone did, so it's not impossible. So it helps. I mean, in our student body, I would say that it's very, very diverse. We have everything. There is no any barriers there. There is to really put effort, right? There.
Yeah. That was I was gonna ask that. Is that something that was very important for you at the very beginning, and also your team, to make sure that
Very
it's not
important.
the one
Very,
specific type of student?
very important for me. We didn't open quotas, but
Mhm.
I think we tried to look at people with what they were trying to bring to us, not how they look at, or, if the father was a post-male person, or, a scientist. As I said, we had people for all sorts of backgrounds. And one thing I was always admire, we had some students that they would have to commute more than 1 hour to get to the lab. And they
Yeah.
will come every day to the lab. They will spend the whole day there. And then they will go to their university because they were studying in the evening from 7 to 11, go back home at midnight, and wake up 5 in the morning to be in the lab at 7. And they were always smiling, detail-oriented, putting a lot of effort, And I mean, I would say, wow, I would not be able to do that.
Yeah.
And they did it continuously because, they were trying really to invest on themselves with a lot of sacrifice.
I can imagine that on your side, it was a lot of work to build this biobank, but I assume that seeing people so invested is also very motivating for you to
It's
keep
very
going.
motivating.
Yeah.
Yeah. We always had the criticism that because we had a lot of students, maybe, we had to put more effort on this, or it was not the same kind of streamline process as we'll have with professional researchers.
Mhm.
But, this was not my experience, right? We had a pipeline that people, when they started, of course, they were always under supervision, and then they will become independent very quickly, and they would do their best because they were invested also in the research. It was not a 9 to 5 study. Many of them had people with dementia in the family, and they had to face, the lack of treatment or even care. So it was important for them.
Yeah, of course. And if we take this in a more like broader sense, what would you say is like contemporary challenges to inclusion, like in the field of neuroimaging? Like what is something you feel like we really have to work more on, if something comes to mind?
I think we became much better in
Mhm.
recruiting people at early stages that are from diverse backgrounds, less good in keeping these folks in our pipelines.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, uh, it comes, students when they come, women, right? They are relatively young. And then in the process, they might get to know someone and they want to do a family. And then, there is not very good mechanism, especially when you are in early stages for getting maternity leave because they are under scholarships, it's not really employment. And, and people think, oh, because this person will have a baby, let's not invest in this person. And, for people of color, sometimes when they are coming to work, they have to face racism, even on the bus coming there. So they come a little bit deflated. And then we think, oh, this person is not behaving with the smiling face, sunny side disposition as someone, who just doesn't have to face this.
Yeah.
So, chronically, there's some point, to some point people tolerate this, but chronically they start giving up and they say, that's not to me, it's too much work. So we need to do better in listening what's going on and trying to understand what are the barriers and how we can improve this. I think we have a collective responsibility. It's not just, pretend that life is just work and we separate everything and we pretend we don't learn about it.
Yeah,
So
I
I
do
think
think it's important to remain human. Like sometimes we work so much with numbers that we kind of forget, but I think it's very important. I really agree with that.
yeah.
And I do think that with our field, I feel like there's a lot of work left to do. And you mentioned being more human. Do you have other maybe ideas of solutions that would be very helpful in terms of being more inclusive, not just as PIs, but even as just peers, like amongst each other?
I will give an example that even happened to me here in the US.
Mm-hmm.
In Brazil, it's the same. So if we have postdocs in the lab, and a postdoc decides to, start a family, and the maternity leave is very short. So if the person takes a longer maternity leave,
Yeah.
or if we decide to be more flexible to let the person, you know, come back in a more humane way, it's on the PI. So there is no mechanism, you know, like a collective pot of money to support this kind of transition back to work. So because of this, what I saw, it's a lot of people that got absolutely stressed out.
Yeah, I can only imagine
And they
having it.
quit. And, you know, or PIs that were very generous, and then you get to the end of your cycle and you didn't produce, and you cannot even justify why not, because you cannot say, well, I have this person who is very keen on maternity leave that just come back for part-time. You know, there is no way to do it. So it comes to a point that it becomes unsustainable. And I think that if we have a mechanism even to support people in the transition, maybe for a few months, the person will not quit, you know, will continue, because you can come back. It's very traumatic.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And what I'm getting the sense is that you think it's more of like a top-down change where like institutions decide to support people.
I think that, yeah, it has to be more on the institution, because PIs cannot do in an individual level for a very long time.
No, of course
Yeah.
not. It has
There
to
are
be a
other
bigger.
things for inclusions. You know, when we came back from the pandemic, there was a wave of violence against Asians here in San Francisco.
Yes.
So some of our employees, they had to come back to the lab or to the office, and they were taking public transportation that was kind of depopulated, right? Because people were still working from home. And they were
Yes.
very afraid to do if they were Asian, because they were afraid to be, I don't know, attacked, right, in public transportation. So how do you deal with this in a way that you provide safety for the person? And again, it's not our fault, right? But it affects us, that the other employees don't feel like, oh, why this person doesn't have to come and I have to come? You know, I mean, there are so many factors that affect life, especially to minorities, that it's so difficult for people that never experienced this even to conceptualize.
Yeah, I really enjoy what you're saying because your view seems to be much more holistic compared to people that really think that you just have to work hard and then that's it. There's nothing else apart working hard. And I don't think it's the whole story. It's a big part of the story, but I don't think it explains everybody's experience entirely.
I don't think that work hard is enough. You know, I've been in an experience, it was not on purpose, but I could experience this. I was maybe in a small committee or in a place, and, you know, because I'm from Brazil and I have an accent and, you know, I'm a woman, if I will say something and a colleague next to me that happens to be, you know, male and, you know, could speak the language and, you know, white, of course, would say something different, automatically everybody would give more credit to the person. I'm not saying the person was saying the same thing as me, but you give more credit to this person, that the person probably was saying something that makes more sense than me, not even looking what has been said, just because my English is not perfect and I'm a woman.
I do think that that's one thing I personally have disliked is the weight, different weight we give depending on where you come from or what you look like. Hopefully we have reduced this, but I still see it sometimes, especially in conferences. You will see people coming from like more the US or more Canada or Europe as opposed to other places. So their, let's say their voice has a lot more weight in terms of like moving the field different ways and things like that.
It's true, but you know, one thing I have been learning now, and I have been experiencing also, is that this kind of, let's say, prejudice, it's partly prejudice, but partly is because there is a way that it's considered the most acceptable way to do certain things. So, you know, when you write a paper, there is a formula to write this paper. You have to be concise, direct sentences, short sentences, and depending on the original language of the individual, the way we structure things are very different. So when these folks, they, you know, submit a piece of writing, it looks so strange. It sounds so strange that automatically, you cannot understand and you reject it. It's not just because you say, oh, this paper is from that place, so we are not taking consideration, because you cannot even read it. Now, when I was training in Brazil and I went to write my first paper, I asked my mentor, how do I write a paper? And my mentor, who also didn't have, formal training, told me, oh, you read some papers and then you kind of figure it out how they write it. And then you try to reproduce something like that. And then during my PhD, I came to the US to spend some time here. And the first thing that my department here enrolled me was in a course on scientific writing. And then I asked, wow, a course of scientific writing. This is what you have for foreigner visitors? And they said, no, this is what we have for everybody. So people from first year of undergraduate studies, they have the opportunity to systematically learn how to write a paper, how to design a study. What are the things you have to consider when you are doing, power analysis? Let's talk about it. It's not like I would study 10 and 10. And this is not true for most of the countries. They are not considered high-income country. So it already makes the competition, it's not just a matter of prejudice to the end product, different when you start. So the ISTA-ART with the Alzheimer's Association, for instance, have been very instrumental in providing training for early career investigators on how do I do a poster? How do I do a short presentation? How do I write, a paper? And I cannot emphasize how important it is, especially for people that has zero access to this kind of training in their home institutions.
There's no question in that training is different, and it makes all the difference when you come to present things or even to build a research design or things like that. I have 2 more questions with you so I don't take up your whole afternoon. So my first question is coming back to your brain imaging method because it is quite unique. Could you walk us through very briefly into what is involved in like the brain staining and all those things to make it accessible to people, like your brain biobank?
So when we started in this brain bank enterprise, we had the opportunity to meet some radiologists who were doing brain imaging and learn from them that most of the interpretation of brain imaging is based on assumption. You have an image that looks very blurred, and then you might use some software so it, artificially make it look less blur, so you think you are seeing something, but actually you don't know what are the elements being used to make this image more visible, right? And because of this, it's difficult to interpret something that it's small, like it's not a tumor, screaming there or bleeding, in a single patient lab. Of course, if you take 100 people from one group, the average maybe will be a little bit different. There is a lot of overlap, right? So the question was, is there a way that we could take a histological image, right? Because this has the best resolution of the same person who had this neuroimaging with MRI, for instance, and put in the same 3D space. So we could do point-to-point correlation, say, okay, if I look at this point here, what exactly does it mean in histology? So we started to work on this with our colleagues from radiology, and also what came to be my postdoc supervisor, Helmut Heisen, who had an interest on this in 2004. So at that point, we've, because of this brain bank, we had the opportunity to take some volunteers, post-mortem volunteers, to put in our MR machine and then extract the brain and try to, cut the brain in a way that will not deform too much, use computers to construct it in 3D, try to fix all these deformations and put in the MRI and do these correlations. And it was a lot of effort, and it looked easier to say than to do. We run in 2 main issues. The first one is the deformation. You take the brain out of the skull, it gets deformed. And the second was you need so much computing capability to deal with it. We didn't have it, even if we tried very much. So the first we could solve, being ingenious, like printing 3D skulls in plastic. So we put the brain and it won't deform. But then the computer problem was an issue, and this we solved here at UCSF together in a partnership with the Daniela OGCM, with the Lawrence Berkeley Lab, that started to teach us how to do parallel computing analysis and using UNet for doing that. So where we are right now. So right now, again, we can take a brain and we can do imaging, and it comes to pathology. We can slap the brain as you want, look for anything we want on the tissue, segment everything, reconstruct everything in 3D, put them together, and then see what they have. So what we are doing with this, we are pretty much validating the PET scanning, because there are a lot of PET tracers, and again, they are, you know, a little bit mysterious.
Yes.
So we are trying to understand exactly what the PET tracer is showing. It's really just the target, is the target plus something else, is just something else. So this is our biggest use for this technology so far.
I have a bit of an ignorant question, and it's because I keep imagining the transportation of the brain in like little Tupperwares with the brain in it. But how do you share the data? Is it like you share the actual brain, or you share like images or
Images.
data? Okay. So you're not playing with the brains. Okay.
Yeah, no, sometimes we transfer the brain from one lab to the other lab, but not from more than 2 or 3 in the network. And then we digitalize everything. We build our own scanner because it was not commercially available. So we can do this high resolution, big images, a lot of stitching. We developed all the computational pipeline for this. But the physical brain really stay in just 2 or 3 places max.
So there's no like sharing the brains.
No. Yeah, people don't even know what to do with it. So there's not a lot of value in this.
It is true that not everybody, and you have to be careful too, because you cannot, if you cut the brain too much, you cannot just stick it back together, right?
We have a very special protocol for this.
So we're really jumping topic from topic, but I guess the listeners are used to it at this point because my thoughts go everywhere. So I wanted to know, which is the last question today, if you had, and I love to ask this to everybody, if there's one thing you could tell your younger self or young researchers in general, what would you say? And I'm sure you've had this question in the past.
I think I would say, you know, keep doing what you are doing. Sometimes you are not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. It will come. I got a lot of anxiety throughout my career. It still happens, but especially at early stages. When I will get a no, I didn't realize that everybody gets more no's than yes. And I felt like an imposter, you know, someone that will never make it because I was stupid. And then after I got, you know, 30 no's, and then I start to get to know people and ask about it, and everybody get all these no's, I started to get more self-secure on myself. But also, one thing I would like to say is, you know, just to know that everybody gets no. So if you get a no, it's kind of part of the norm. Doesn't mean you get a yes after this. You only get a yes after this if you really learn from your no. What is the feedback? Are you writing in a clear way? Is there anyone that can help you to improve your line of thought? Is there a kind of experiment that's kind of low-hanging fruit and you can do even without a lot of money that can improve your chances? Don't be passive.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
And I had a discussion with a PI not too long ago for the second episode of the podcast. And that's one big point he mentioned, that a failure, it's such a bummer that in the field we see failures as opposed to opportunities to learn. Like we see them so negatively that we fail to use them to get better. But then again, I do feel like it's a big societal change that has to happen, not just within the individual, of course, but also as a big picture, because it's hard when you see everybody succeeding all the time and then you get a no. You get self-conscious.
Yeah, people don't succeed all the time. That's the point.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then when you go on Twitter, that's all
but we don't advertise, you know, oh, we got another rejection.
Yes. Of course. It would be nice though, but I do see what you mean. So we are getting to the end of the podcast. Is there anything that I haven't said you would like to mention at the moment, or any places people can find you, your Twitter, or any resources you want to put forward at the for today?
Sure. My Twitter is a good one. It's Grinberg_T. And my email is just my institutional email, super easy to find. And what I wanted to say, it's great you are doing this podcast. I think it's such a service for everybody. When I started, I didn't really have resources to see what people were doing, what they are thinking, if I was trying to do the right thing. So it has super value.
Yeah, it's really nice to talk about science in general and to make it accessible to people. So I would like to thank you for taking the time. And if other people like this format, you can always email me and we can talk about cool science stuff. So for today, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see each other probably in Amsterdam.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.